It was the morning of October 17th, 1987, just outside a small farming town called Red Willow, Kansas, when the ground itself seemed to swallow $1 million machine whole. The fog hadn't fully lifted yet. It clung low across the fields like a damp sheet wrapping around steel mud, and men who hadn't slept in nearly 48 hours. Out there, in the middle of what used to be a dry construction site, a towering yellow crane leaned at a sickening angle, its massive tracks buried deep in black, sucking earth. Every few minutes, the mud made a slow, wet sound as if it were breathing, pulling the machine further down inch by inch, and every man standing there knew the same thing. If that crane went any deeper, it wasn't coming back out. The company had already thrown everything at it. 3 brand new bulldozers, steel cables thick as a man's arm, engineers with clipboards calculations, and growing frustration. Nothing had worked. Every attempt had only made it worse. The more force they used, the deeper the crane sank. By sunrise, the word had spread. People came in trucks and old pickups, even on foot, lining up along the edge of the field. Farmers, mechanics, curious locals. They stood there in silence, hands in their pockets, watching something expensive and very modern slowly lose a fight against something older than all of them, the land. And just when the tension had settled into something heavy and quiet, an unfamiliar sound broke through the fog. Not the sharp growl of a diesel engine, not the clean, aggressive roar of new machinery. The sound was slower, rougher, a deep rhythmic chug, like iron lungs breathing after a long sleep. Heads began to turn. From the far end of the dirt road, just beyond the fence line, something was coming. At first it looked like a shadow moving through the mist, low to the ground, wide, unhurried. Then the light shifted just enough to catch its shape. Steel tracks, worn edges, a long, weathered body, painted in a faded, almost forgotten yellow. A caterpillar, old, very old, and sitting behind its controls, barely visible beneath a wide, dust-covered hat, was a man no one in that crowd had paid any attention to before. He didn't rush, he didn't wave, he didn't even look at the crowd. He just drove straight toward the sinking crane, like he already knew something the rest of them didn't. The first man to laugh was wearing a clean white hard hat. He stood a little apart from the others, boots barely touched by mud, a rolled blueprint tucked under his arm like a badge of authority. His name was Richard Collins, the lead engineer brought in from Wichita, and for the past 2 days, he had been the smartest man on that field. At least that's what everyone believed. He watched the old caterpillar crawl closer, its metal tracks grinding slowly over the wet ground, and let out a short, dismissive chuckle. Well, he said loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, "Looks like the museum sent us some help." A few of the workers snorted. Someone in the back muttered, "That thing still runs." The laughter spread not loud, but sharp enough to cut. The old machine came to a stop about 30 feet from the crane. Its engine idled low, steady, almost patient. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the man climbed down. He moved without hurry, boots sinking slightly into the mud, one step at a time. He was older than most had expected. Late 60s, maybe early 70s. Lean, weathered, with the kind of posture that didn't come from gyms, but from years of lifting, fixing, enduring. His shirt was faded sleeves rolled. His hands were dark with oil that no amount of washing had ever fully removed. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked at the crane. Long, quiet, careful. Richard took a few steps forward, a faint smile still hanging on his face. "Sir," he called out, voice polite, but edged with something else. "This is a restricted work site." The old man didn't answer. Instead, he walked past him, straight toward the edge of the pit where the crane was sinking. He stopped just short of the worst of the mud, crouched slightly, and studied the ground like a man reading something written beneath the surface. That silence. It didn't sit well with Richard. "We've already tried everything," he continued louder now. 3 machines, high-tensile cables, calculated pull angles. "It's not coming out." Still no response. The old man reached down, picked up a small clump of wet soil, pressed it between his fingers. Then let it fall. Only then did he speak. "You're pulling it wrong." It wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive. But somehow, everyone heard it. A ripple went through the crowd. Richard blinked, then let out a short laugh, this time sharper. "I'm sorry, what was that?" The old man stood up slowly, wiped his hand against his pants, and finally looked at him. Up close, his eyes were steady. Not angry. Not impressed. Just certain. "You're fighting the weight," he said, "not the ground." A few of the workers exchanged looks. Someone in the back shook his head. Richard smiled again, but now it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Sir?" "With all due respect," he said, adjusting his gloves. "This isn't a farm truck stuck in a ditch. That crane weighs over 60 tons. The old man gave a small nod. "I can see that." Another pause. Then Richard gestured toward the caterpillar sitting there, like a relic from another time. "And you think that thing is going to do what 3 modern machines couldn't?" A louder laugh this time. Even some of the onlookers joined in. One of the younger workers called out, "You gonna tow it with a horse next?" The old man didn't react, didn't defend himself, didn't raise his voice. He just glanced back at his machine, then back at the crane, and for a brief moment, so brief most people missed it, his expression changed. Not doubt, not hesitation, recognition, like he had seen something like this before. Richard exhaled, already turning away. "I appreciate the enthusiasm," he said, dismissive now. "But we're not turning this into a sideshow. That should have been the end of it. And for most men, it would have been." But the old farmer didn't leave. He took one step closer to the pit, eyes still fixed on the half-swallowed crane, and said something so quiet it almost disappeared into the wind. "If you keep pulling like that, you'll bury it by noon." Richard stopped, just for a second, and though he didn't turn around right away, something in the tone, calm, unshaken, almost matter-of-fact, made the laughter behind him fade just a little. Because whether they wanted to admit it or not, the crane had already sunk deeper since sunrise. For a long moment, no one said anything. The wind moved across the open field, carrying the smell of wet earth and diesel, and somewhere in the distance, a loose sheet of metal clanged softly against a trailer. The kind of sound you only notice when everything else has gone quiet. Richard slowly turned back. This time he didn't smile. "You've got 5 minutes, he said, his voice flatter now. "Then I need you off this site." It wasn't permission. It was dismissal with a clock attached. The old man didn't argue, didn't nod, didn't even acknowledge the tone. He simply stepped closer to the edge again, as if the conversation had never mattered in the first place. And that, more than anything, unsettled people. Because men who are wrong tend to explain themselves. Men who are unsure tend to talk. But this man said almost nothing. He just looked, carefully, deliberately, as if the mud, the weight, the angle of the crane, none of it was random. As if it was all part of something he already understood. But there was something nobody there knew, something that didn't show in the rust on that caterpillar, or the quiet way the old man moved. His name was Walter Hayes, and he had been reading Land Like This since before Richard Collins had ever touched a blueprint. Walter was born just 6 miles from that very field, in a farmhouse that no longer existed. Back when the land wasn't parceled out and sold to companies with polished trucks and office trailers. Back when the soil wasn't just something you built on, but something you survived with. His father, Thomas Hayes, never went to school past the age of 14, but he could listen to an engine, the way some men listen to music. He could tell you what was wrong with a machine before you even shut it off, and more importantly, he could tell you what the ground was going to do. That mattered back then, because in the early 1930s, during the worst years of the Depression, the land didn't forgive mistakes. It swallowed crops, it cracked under drought, and when the rains finally came, It turned into something thick, heavy, and dangerous. Machines got stuck. Wagons disappeared halfway to their axles. Men lost entire harvests because they didn't understand what they were standing on. Walter had been 8 years old the first time he saw it happen. A grain wagon overloaded pulled too early after a storm. His father had warned the neighbor to wait. The man didn't listen. By afternoon, the wagon was gone up to the wheels. By evening, even the horses couldn't pull it free. Walter still remembered standing there, watching the mud ripple slowly around the wheels, like it was alive. "What you see ain't what holds you," his father had told him that day, resting a hand on his shoulder. "It's what's underneath that decides whether you move or stay." Walter never forgot that. And years later, neither did the machine. The caterpillar sitting behind him wasn't just old. It was history. Built in 1928, back when machines were made heavy on purpose, thick steel, low gearing. Built not for speed, but for patience. His father had bought it secondhand in 1936, trading nearly half a season's harvest for it. People called him foolish, said the thing was outdated even then. But Thomas Hayes had seen something different. He had taken that machine apart, piece by piece over the years, adjusted the transmission, reinforced the drive system, tuned it for one thing modern equipment had slowly forgotten in its race for efficiency. Slow, relentless torque, not power you could hear, power you could feel, deep in the ground. Walter grew up with that machine, learned its sounds before he learned to read, knew when it was working too hard, and when it was just waiting. And standing there now, watching that crane sink inch by inch into a bed of unstable soil, he wasn't seeing a problem. He was seeing a mistake, the kind of mistake he had seen before, more than once. Back on the edge of the field, someone whispered, "Why's he just standing there?" Another man shrugged. "Old people, they think slow." But what they didn't understand was this. Walter wasn't thinking slow. He was thinking deep. Deep, because this story wasn't really about a machine stuck in the mud. Not yet. It was about something far more dangerous. The moment when a man believes he understands something, just because he has numbers to prove it. And what happens when the ground decides otherwise? Richard checked his watch. 4 minutes left. That was how long he was willing to entertain what he had already decided was a waste of time. Behind him, the crane let out a low metallic groan as its weight shifted again. One of the rear supports sank another inch, maybe 2. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't crash or collapse. But every man there saw it, and every man felt it, because they all knew, whether they admitted it or not, that the situation was getting worse. "We need to pull again," one of the foremen said, stepping closer to Richard. "If we wait any longer..." I know Richard snapped a little too quickly. He didn't like being reminded. Didn't like the pressure building behind his ribs. For 2 days, he had been in control of this site. Every decision, every command, every calculation, it all ran through him. And now there was a man standing in the mud, barely saying a word, somehow making that control feel thinner than it should. Richard turned back toward Walter. "All right," he said louder now, drawing the attention of the crowd again. "You've had your look." Walter didn't move, didn't answer. He was staring at the left side of the crane now, where the ground dipped slightly before rising again toward a patch of drier soil. It was subtle. Most wouldn't have noticed it, but he had. I said. Richard started, irritation creeping into his voice. "You pulled from the wrong side." Walter spoke without turning. The sentence landed differently this time. Not like a suggestion, like a correction. A few of the workers shifted their weight. Someone glanced at the cables still stretched tight across the mud, leading from the crane to the 3 bulldozers, parked in a line behind it. "That's the only stable angle we've got," Richard replied, sharper now. "We already tested the others." Walter finally looked at him. "Tested it? How?" The question hung in the air longer than it should have. Richard frowned. "We ran the load calculations. The ground pressure. The resistance." "No," Walter said, cutting him off gently. "I mean, how did it move?" Silence. It was a strange question. Not wrong. Just not the kind of thing anyone there had been asking. Richard hesitated for half a second, just enough for a few people to notice, then straightened his posture. It didn't move, he said. That's the point. Walter nodded slowly. Yeah, he said. That's exactly the point. A few of the older men in the crowd exchanged looks, because suddenly, it didn't sound like nonsense anymore. Walter turned back to the crane and took a few careful steps along the edge, circling slightly, his boots pressing into the softer patches of earth. He stopped again near the front corner, where the mud looked darker, wetter. If you pull straight back, he continued, almost as if he were talking to himself, you're dragging the whole weight against suction. He bent slightly, pressing his boot into the ground, testing it. It's not just heavy, he said. It's held. One of the workers frowned. Held by what? Walter glanced up briefly. The ground don't just sit there, he said. It grabs. That word, grabbed, made a few people uncomfortable, because they had seen it. They had watched the crane sink, not just from weight, but from something pulling it down. Richard exhaled, running a hand over his jaw. We already know it's stuck, he said. That's why we're pulling it out. Walter shook his head just once. No, he said quietly. You're trying to rip it out. He pointed not dramatically, just a small motion with 2 fingers toward the cables. You keep fighting the mud like it's solid, he said. But it ain't. It moves. Slow. But it moves. The wind picked up slightly, brushing across the field, and every time you yank on it. Walter continued. You're sealing it tighter. That, Few heads turn, because it explained something no one had been able to, why every attempt had made things worse. Richard opened his mouth to respond, but stopped, because for the first time in Tuda, he didn't have an immediate answer. And that was when something shifted. Not in the ground, not in the crane, but in the crowd. The laughter from earlier was gone, replaced by something quieter, something more dangerous. Doubt. Walter straightened up slowly, brushing his hands together. Then he looked back at his caterpillar, old, faded, quietly idling like it had all the time in the world. I can pull it, he said. No bravado, no challenge, just a statement. Richard let out a short breath, almost a laugh, but it didn't carry the same confidence anymore. With that, he asked, nodding toward the machine. Walter followed his gaze. For a moment, he didn't say anything, and in that silence, something else surfaced. A memory. Not here, not now, but years ago. A different field, a different machine. His father standing beside him, younger than Walter was, now tightening a chain with steady hands. Don't fight what's holding it, Thomas Hayes had said back then. You make it want to let go. Walter blinked once, returning to the present. Then he looked at Richard. Yeah, he said. With this, another pause. Longer this time, because now, it wasn't just an old man talking anymore. It was a possibility no one there had planned for. Richard glanced at the crane, then at the mud, then back at Walter. And though he didn't realize it yet, this was the moment control began to slip, because what happened next was the part nobody there would ever forget. For a few seconds, Richard said nothing. He just stood there, staring at that old caterpillar, as if the answer might be written somewhere on its rusted frame. The engine kept that same slow, steady rhythm. Chug, 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 like it had no interest in proving anything to anyone. Around them, the field had gone quiet. No one laughed now. No one made another joke, because something had shifted, not enough to change minds completely, but enough to make people wait. And waiting in a place like that meant doubt had already begun to take root. Richard finally exhaled. Fine, he said. His voice controlled, but tighter than before. You want to try something different? Go ahead. He turned slightly, addressing the foreman. But we do this my way, he added quickly. We monitor the load. If anything shifts too far, we stop it immediately. I'm not losing that crane because of a theory. He didn't look at Walter when he said it. Didn't have to. The word hung there anyway. Theory. Walter didn't react, didn't correct him. He simply nodded once and walked back toward his machine. Now all eyes followed him, even the ones that had been so certain before, because this was no longer just curiosity. This was a gamble, and everyone knew it. As Walter climbed up onto the caterpillar, something became clear to anyone paying close attention. He wasn't in a hurry. He didn't rush to start pulling, didn't bark orders, didn't ask for help. He sat there for a moment, hands resting lightly on the controls, listening. Not to the people, not to Richard, to the machine. That low, steady engine note. It told him everything he needed to know. Then he eased it forward, slowly. The tracks pressed into the mud, but not deep. The weight distributed differently than the newer machine soars. Broader. Lower. It didn't bite into the ground the same way. It settled, instead of fighting. That was the first thing a few of the older men noticed. "Look at that," someone murmured. Walter didn't drive straight toward the crane. That alone caused a stir. Instead, he angled off to the side, toward that slight rise in the terrain he had noticed earlier. The patch of ground that looked just a little firmer, just a little less saturated. Richard frowned immediately. "What's he doing?" he muttered. "That's not the optimal angle," one of the engineers added. Flipping through notes, but Walter kept moving, slow, deliberate, until the caterpillar came to a stop at a position no one else had even considered. Not directly behind the crane, not in line with the previous pulls, off to the side, almost diagonal. And then he shut the engine down. That confused people even more. "Why'd he stop?" someone asked. Walter climbed down again, reached into the back of the machine, and pulled out a set of chains. Not new ones, not polished steel. Old chains, thick, darkened with age and use. He dragged them across the mud, with a steady, practiced motion, each link clinking softly against the next. And then, this was the part that made Richard step closer. Walter didn't attach the chain where the others had. Not to the main pulling point, not to the reinforced frame. He probably walked around the crane boots, sinking deeper now, studying the angles again, until he found a lower section of the structure half covered in mud. He crouched, clearing away some of the sludge with his hands. "There's nothing there," one of the engineers said. "That's not a load-bearing point." Walter didn't look up. "No," he said. "It ain't." Another pause. Then he hooked the chain anyway. A few men shook their heads. "This is a waste of time." But there was something nobody realized yet. Something buried not in the mud, but inside that old caterpillar. Because years ago, long before Walter ever touched those controls, his father had changed something deep within that machine. Not for speed, not for efficiency, but for control. The gearing had been modified to deliver an unusual kind of torque, one that didn't spike under pressure, but built slowly, steadily, like a rising tide instead of a crashing wave. Modern machines pulled hard. This one pulled patient. And that difference, it was about to matter more than anything else on that field. Walter climbed back into the seat, adjusted the throttle just slightly, and brought the engine back to life. That deep, steady chug returned. He looked once more at the crane, then at the chain, then at the ground beneath it, and for the first time since he arrived, he spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "You don't pull it out," he said, Vasa. "A beat. You let it come loose." Richard crossed his arms, watching closely now, skeptical, but no longer dismissive, because whether he liked it or not, everything about this moment felt different. Walter placed his hand on the control lever, didn't yank it, didn't rush. He eased it forward, just a fraction. The caterpillar responded immediately, not with a roar, but with a deep growing force. Quiet, steady, undeniable. The chain tightened, slowly, not snapping into tension, but stretching into it. The crane didn't move, not yet. A few seconds passed, then 10, then 15, somewhere in the crowd. Someone whispered nothing's happening, but Walter didn't stop, didn't increase power, didn't change angle. He just held it there, letting the force build, slowly, consistently. And then something happened, so small, most people almost missed it. A soft shift, a subtle sound, not from the machine, from the ground. A wet releasing noise, like something letting go. Walter's eyes narrowed slightly, because he felt it, before anyone else saw it. And what he knew in that moment, what nobody else understood yet, was that the crane hadn't been pulled, not even an inch, but the ground beneath it had just begun to change. At first, no one reacted, because nothing obvious had happened. The crane was still there, still leaning, still half swallowed by the same thick black mud that had held it for 2 long days. But Walter didn't move. He didn't push harder, didn't reach for more throttle. He just held the line. Steady. Patient, like a man waiting for something he already trusted. And that, made people uneasy. Why isn't he increasing power? One of the younger engineers whispered. Richard didn't answer, because he was watching something else now. The ground, right near the base of the crane. It was subtle, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. The mud wasn't pulling down anymore. It was shifting, slowly, almost reluctantly. It began to loosen its grip. Another sound followed, a deeper one, not loud but unmistakable, a wet, hollow release. Like air escaping from somewhere it had been trapped too long. Walter leaned forward slightly in his seat, not excited, not surprised, just confirming, because this was the part most people never understood. The part you couldn't calculate on paper, the part his father had tried to teach him when he was just a boy, standing in a flooded field. You don't fight suction, Thomas Hayes had said. You break it. Back at the crane, one of the steel tracks trembled, just a fraction, but it was enough. Did you see that someone said, "I think it moved"? Richard stepped closer. Boots sinking deeper now as he approached the edge. His eyes locked onto the base of the machine. There, a gap, so small it barely looked real, but it was there. The mud had separated just enough to let air in, and that changed everything, because once the seal broke, the ground lost its hold. Walter eased the lever forward, just a little more, not a surge, not a jerk, just a quiet increase in pressure. The caterpillar responded the same way it always had, slow, relentless. The chain tightened further, humming now with tension, but still not straining. And then the crane moved. This time it was a full inch, maybe 2. The front lifted slightly, the angle shifting just enough to send a ripple through the entire structure. The crowd gasped, not loudly, but all at once, like a single breath pulled in by dozens of people at the same time. "No way," someone whispered. Richard didn't speak. He couldn't, because for the first time in 48 hours, the machine had responded, and not to force, not to power, but to something else entirely. Walter kept the pressure steady, didn't celebrate, didn't even look up, because he knew this part mattered more than anything. If he rushed it now, if he tried to pull too fast, the ground would close again, and they'd be right back where they started. So he waited, let the machine do what it was built to do. The old caterpillar dug in, not downward but outward. Its wide tracks spread the weight, holding firm, where the newer machines had sunk. Another slow pull, another shift. This time the crane rose higher. Mud slid off its frame in thick, heavy sheets. The sound was louder now, wet, tearing, releasing. The kind of sound that told you something stuck was finally coming free. The crowd took a step closer, then another. No one was laughing anymore. No one was doubting, because they were watching it happen, right in front of them. A machine everyone had written off, doing what none of the others could. Richard swallowed, hard, because now, this wasn't just a recovery. This was a correction of everything he had said, everything he had believed. Walter pulled again. Same pace, same patience, and the crane came with it, slowly, steadily. I need to stop here for a moment, because this is the part people tend to misunderstand. They think this was about strength, about horsepower, about old versus new, but it wasn't. It was about knowing when not to force something, knowing when to wait, and knowing what the ground was trying to tell you before it was too late. Back in the field, the crane was nearly free now. Its tracks, once buried, were visible again, coated in thick mud, but no longer trapped. One final pull. Walter adjusted the lever just slightly. The caterpillar answered with that same deep and mud-filling push, and then, with a long, heavy sound, the crane broke free, completely. It rolled forward a few feet, settling onto firmer ground with a solid, undeniable weight. For a second, no one moved, no one spoke. And then, the field erupted. Voices, shouts, disbelief spilling out all at once. Did you see that? He pulled it out. After 2 days, But Walter didn't join them. He didn't raise his arms, didn't smile. He simply eased the throttle back, letting the engine settle into its quiet rhythm again, like nothing extraordinary had happened at all. Because to him, it hadn't. He had just listened, and the ground had finally answered. The noise rolled across the field like a storm breaking. Men who had stood silent for hours were suddenly shouting, clapping each other on the back, pointing at the crane as if it might disappear if they looked away. Even the ones who had laughed earlier, even the ones who had shaken their heads, they were the loudest now, because what they had just seen didn't fit into anything they understood. 3 modern machines had failed, calculations had failed, experience, at least the kind written on paper, had failed, and yet, that old caterpillar moving slower than anything else on that field had done it. But in the middle of all that noise, Walter Hayes sat still, one hand resting lightly on the controls, eyes on the ground, not the crowd, as if he were making sure the job was truly finished. And not just one, because there was something else most people didn't notice. The crane wasn't just free. It was stable, not tilted, not threatening to sink again. It had come out clean, and that mattered more than the pull itself. Richard stood a few steps away, staring at it, at the crane, at the ground, then slowly at Walter. The noise around him faded, not because it actually stopped, but because his mind had already pulled away from it. He replayed everything, the angles, the force, the timing, and none of it lined up with what he had been certain of just minutes before. He took a step forward, then another, until he was standing beside the caterpillar. Up close, the machine looked even older. Scratches layered over scratches, bolts that had clearly been replaced by hand, metal that didn't shine, but held. He reached out almost without thinking and touched the side panel. It was warm, alive in a way no new machine ever felt. Walter finally looked at him, not with triumph, not with satisfaction, just waiting. Richard opened his mouth, closed it again. Then after a long pause, he spoke. "How did you know?" It wasn't a challenge. It wasn't defensive. It was honest. Walter studied him for a moment, then glanced back at the crane. "You kept trying to move it," he said. Richard frowned slightly. "That was the point." Walter shook his head. "No," he said. "That was the problem." Another pause. Then he gestured toward the ground with a small tilt of his chin. "It wasn't stuck because it was heavy," he continued. "It was stuck because it was sealed." Richard listened, really listened this time. Walter crouched slightly, picking up another bit of soil, letting it fall slowly through his fingers. "You pull too hard, too fast." He said, "You press it tighter, like trying to yank your boot out of a deep mud. The harder you fight it, the deeper it holds you." Richard's eyes flicked back to the crane, then to the cable still lying slack in the field. "So you just—" He hesitated, searching for the word. "Waited." Walter gave a faint nod, gave it time to breathe. That word again, breathe. It sounded simple, too simple. But standing there, with the evidence right in front of him, Richard couldn't argue with it. There was a silence between them now, different from before, not tense, not dismissive, something else, respect, beginning to form. "What about the machine?" Richard asked, after a moment glancing back at the caterpillar. "That thing shouldn't have had enough power to do that." Walter looked at it too. For a second, something softer crossed his face. "Power ain't always loud," he said. Then after a brief pause, "My father used to say, if you build something right, it won't fight you when you need it most." Richard didn't respond right away, because suddenly, this wasn't just about a machine anymore. It wasn't even about the crane. It was about something he hadn't accounted for, something he had dismissed the moment he saw it. Experience. The kind you couldn't measure, the kind that didn't come with diagrams or numbers. Behind them, the celebration was still going. The foreman was already on the radio calling it in. The company would be relieved. The losses stopped. The project saved. But none of that seemed as important in that moment, because something else had shifted. Not in the ground, not in the machines, but in the way people were looking at Walter Hayes, no longer as a man out of time, but as someone who had seen something they hadn't even known to look for. One of the younger workers approached slowly, almost hesitant. "Sir," he said, glancing at the caterpillar, "that thing. How old is it?" Walter looked over at him. "Older than me," he said. A small ripple of laughter followed, but it wasn't mocking this time. It was amazed. The young man nodded, then asked the question everyone else was thinking. Why didn't you say something sooner? Walter considered that, then shrugged lightly. Wouldn't have mattered, he said. The worker blinked. Why not? Walter looked back at Richard, not unkindly, just honestly. Sometimes he said people gotta get stuck before they're ready to listen. The words settled over the group. Quiet, heavy, true. Richard lowered his gaze for a moment, because he knew they weren't just about the crane. And for the first time since he arrived on that field, he didn't feel like the man in charge. He felt like the one who had just learned something. Walter climbed down from the caterpillar once more, not to celebrate, not to explain further, just to unhook the chain. He worked slowly, methodically, as if this part mattered just as much as the pull itself, because to him, it did. The job wasn't finished until everything was put back right. When he was done, he coiled the chain carefully and placed it back on the machine. Then he climbed up again. No speech, no goodbye. He simply started the engine. That same deep, steady rhythm returning once more, and began to turn the caterpillar around. Richard watched him. Wait, he called out. Walter paused, looked back. Richard hesitated. There were a dozen things he could have said. An apology, a compliment, a question. But in the end, only one came out. Thank you. Walter held his gaze for a moment, then gave a small nod, nothing more, and drove off, slowly, unhurried, the same way he had arrived, leaving behind a field that felt different now, not because a crane had been saved, but because something invisible had shifted. And what happened after that day, that was the part people kept talking about for years. By the end of that week, the story had already spread beyond Red Willow. It started the way these things always do. A foreman told a supplier. The supplier told a driver. The driver told a mechanic 2 towns over. And by the time it reached Wichita, it had turned into something almost unreal. An old farmer, a machine from 1928, a crane no one could move, pulled free in minutes. Some people didn't believe it, said it had to be exaggerated, said there was no way an antique tractor outperformed modern equipment. But others, the ones who had been there, they didn't argue. They didn't need to, because they had heard it. That sound, that slow, steady pull, and they had seen something even harder to explain the moment the ground let go. Back at the company office, things were less poetic. Reports were filed, numbers were calculated, losses were revised. And somewhere in the middle of all that paperwork, one name kept appearing. Walter Hayes. Not as an employee, not as a contractor, just a note. A line in a report that didn't quite fit the format. Local operator assisted in recovery. That was how they wrote it. Clean, simple, almost forgettable. But the men who had stood in that field knew better, because what happened that morning didn't feel like assistance. It felt like correction. Richard sat at his desk late one evening, the report open in front of him. He had rewritten that line 3 times, each version sounding wrong in a different way. Too formal, too vague. Too incomplete, because none of them captured what had actually happened. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, and for the first time in years, he questioned something he had always trusted. Not the math, not the training, but the assumption behind it, that knowing more meant understanding more. A few days later, he got in his truck, didn't tell anyone where he was going, just drove, out past the main roads, past the newer developments, back into the kind of land that didn't change much from year to year. It took him nearly an hour to find the place. A small farmhouse set back from the road, paint worn thin by time. A fence that had been repaired more times than replaced. And there off to the side, he saw it, the caterpillar, parked under a simple metal awning. Quiet now, still, like it had always belonged there. Richard stepped out of the truck and stood for a moment unsure what he expected. Then the door of the house opened. Walter stepped out. Same hat, same steady posture, like nothing had changed. They looked at each other across the yard. No crowd this time, no noise, just 2 men. And the space between what they thought they knew. Richard walked forward. I wasn't sure you'd remember me, he said. Walter gave a small shrug. Field like that, hard to forget. There was a hint of something in his voice. Not humor exactly, but close. Richard nodded. I've been thinking about what you said, he admitted. About not fighting what's holding it. Walter listened, didn't interrupt. I've spent my whole career solving problems by applying more force, Richard continued. More resources. Better machines. He paused, and it worked. Most of the time. Walter tilted his head slightly. Most ain't all. Richard let out a quiet breath. No, he said. It isn't. They stood there for a moment. Then Richard glanced toward the caterpillar. Can I ask you something? Walter followed his gaze. Go ahead. Richard hesitated, then asked the question that had been sitting with him since that morning in the mud. Why didn't you ever upgrade? Walter looked at the machine. Longer this time, as if the answer wasn't just words, but something lived. Because it never gave me a reason to, he said. Richard frowned slightly. But newer machines are faster, stronger, more efficient. Walter nodded. Sometimes, he said. Then he turned back to him. But they don't always listen. That answer lingered, because it didn't fully make sense. Until it did. Walter stepped closer to the caterpillar and rested a hand on its side. This one, he said, I know when it's working too hard. I know when it's got more to give. I know when to stop before it breaks. He looked back at Richard. Can you say that about all your machines? Richard didn't answer, because he couldn't, and they both knew it. The wind moved through the dry grass around them, quiet, unrushed, just like everything else on that land. Richard nodded slowly, then extended his hand. Walter looked at it for a moment, then shook it. Firm, simple, no need for anything more. Richard turned back toward his truck, but before he got in, he paused. There's something else, he said. Walter waited. We're bringing in new equipment next month. Bigger site. More complicated ground conditions. A beat. I was wondering if you'd be willing to take a look. Walter didn't answer right away. He glanced out across his land. The fields, the soil, the things he understood without needing to explain. Then I'd back at Richard. I don't do contracts, he said. Richard gave a small nod. I figured. Another pause. Then Walter added, but I'll come by. Richard smiled, not the confident smile from before, a quieter one, grateful, and then he left. Over the years, the story changed a little each time it was told. Some said the crane was bigger. Some said the mud was deeper. Some said the old caterpillar had been rebuilt with parts no one could identify. But the people who had actually been there, they told it simpler. They said a man who understood the land, showed a man who understood machines, that they weren't the same thing, and that one didn't replace the other. Because in the end, it wasn't about old versus new, or farmer versus engineer. It was about something far easier to overlook, the difference between forcing a problem and understanding it. And if there was one thing that day in Red Willow proved, it was this. Never laugh at something just because it looks old. Never dismiss a man just because he speaks less than you do. And never assume that progress means you've left wisdom behind. Because sometimes, the quietest voice in the field is the only one that knows how to set things free. And for a long time, that should have been the end of it. A story told over coffee. A lesson quietly learned. A moment where pride met something older and lost. But there was one part of that day people didn't talk about as much. Not because it wasn't important, but because most of them didn't even realize it had happened. Not until much later. About 3 weeks after the crane incident, the company returned to the site to resume work. New schedules, new safety measures, more equipment brought in this time with extra precautions, extra oversight, and far less confidence than before. Richard was back too, but not the same way. He didn't stand apart anymore, didn't carry himself like the man with all the answers. He walked the ground more, watched more, listened more, and on the second morning back, he saw something. It wasn't dramatic, just a section of soil near the original pit, slightly darker than the rest, slightly softer underfoot. Most people would have ignored it, kept working, but Richard stopped. He crouched, pressed his hand into the dirt, and for a moment, he didn't think about numbers. He thought about something else. Breath. He stood up immediately. Shut it down, he called out. The foreman looked confused. What? Shut it down. Richard repeated firmer this time. All of it. Engines cut. Noise faded. Men looked around unsure. What's going on? Someone asked. Richard didn't answer right away. He just stared at the ground, because what he felt wasn't obvious, but it was familiar, too familiar. If we run heavy equipment over this, he said finally, we're going to lose more than a crane. The foreman frowned. You sure? Richard nodded, not because he had calculated it, but because, for the first time, he recognized it. They rerouted the work that day, brought in gravel, reinforced the area, took extra time, spent extra money, and nothing sank. Not a single machine, no delays, no disaster. A quiet decision. That saved them from repeating the same mistake. And that was the part no report ever mentioned, because there was no failure to record, no incident to explain, just something that didn't happen, because someone had finally learned to see it coming. Weeks later, Richard found himself back at Walter's farm again. This time he didn't come with questions. He came with something else, understanding. They stood near the edge of the field as the sun dipped low, painting the land in long shadows. I almost made the same mistake again, Richard admitted. Walter glanced at him. But you didn't. Richard shook his head slightly. No, he said. Because I remembered what you said. A small silence followed. Then Richard added, I think I've been solving the wrong kind of problems. Walter didn't ask him to explain. He didn't need to. Some realizations. Don't need words. They stood there a while longer. Two men from different worlds, now standing on the same ground. And maybe that's what this story was really about. Not the crane, not the machine. Not even the moment everything turned around, but what came after. Because anyone can be right once. Anyone, God. But changing how you see the world, that's something else entirely. And it doesn't happen in a single moment. It happens slowly, the way that old caterpillar pulled. Steady, patient, unforced. Years passed. The site at Red Willow was finished. Buildings went up. Roads were laid. And most people who drove past it never knew what had happened there. They saw progress, structure, modern work done with modern machines. But buried underneath all of it was a quiet story of a morning when everything stopped, when certainty failed, when something old outperformed something new, and more importantly, when a man chose to listen instead of insist. Walter Hayes never became famous. He didn't appear in magazines, didn't sell his machine, didn't change the way he lived. He kept working his land, fixing what needed fixing, saying little, understanding much. And that caterpillar, it stayed right where it had always been, under that same metal awning, ready when needed, silent when not, because some things don't need attention to prove their worth. And maybe that's the final truth in all of this, the kind that doesn't come with applause, or headlines, or recognition, just quiet certainty, that the world still belongs not to the loudest voice, not to the newest machine, but to the ones who understand what they're standing on. So the next time you see something old, or someone who doesn't speak as much as the others, don't be so quick to decide what they're worth, because somewhere beneath the surface, there might be something you haven't learned to see yet. And if you ignore it, if you rush past it, if you try to force your way through it, you might not just get stuck. You might miss the one thing that could have set you free.